that, ladies and gentlemen, was Victor Fleming's production of John Steinbeck's Tortilla Flat. Hope you enjoyed it. That great critic for the New Yorker magazine, Pauline Kael, thought it was a very happy transfer to the screen from the original novel, and she thought it was a very sort of genial sort of picture. I would like to mention here that I hope a number of you out there weren't upset by the fact that whites or Anglos such as Spencer Tracy were portraying Hispanics or paisanos. There was maybe a mild touch of racism in there, but I didn't find it too bothersome. After all, the picture was made back in '42, and it is a John Steinbeck novel adaptation. It is worthy of being seen, so do forgive it these inadequacies. Well, now we're going to go to a few TVOntario highlights, and then I shall be promptly back.
Stay tuned for more Saturday Night at the Movies.
The scientists will explore the deep sea in the submersible Alvin, an extraordinary spaceship of the inner world. Equipped with a revolutionary television camera, they will take unprecedented motion pictures of strange creatures in the black abyss.
Tuesday at 8, a National Geographic special, Dive to the Edge of Creation. It was long believed that due to lack of light, the ocean floor could not support any living things. But recently, a geologist discovered vents in the ocean floor, which were surrounded by a profusion of unknown marine life. National Geographic takes you on the expedition that was mounted to photograph and sample the life forms in those deep sea vents. Dive to the Edge of Creation, Tuesday at 8 on National Geographic.
Wednesday at 9, Film International returns for a special twice-weekly engagement beginning with the award-winning Japanese film Muddy River. Kichi's life on the water is not easy, and his mother must support the family as best she can. Don't miss one of the finest films ever made about children, Muddy River, Wednesday at 9 on Film International.
Guten Tag, zu wem möchten Sie bitte?
Ich möchte zu meiner Schwester, Marianne Klein.
Then Thursday at 9, the second half of the double bill features Marianne and Julianne, director Margareta von Trotta's absorbing study of two sisters, one a feminist journalist, the other a jailed terrorist.
Wir arbeiten, Marianne, seit Jahren. Was wir machen, ist wichtig, nicht nur für mich. Es waren kleine, manchmal winzige Erfolge, aber mit euren Bomben habt ihr alles zerstört.
Dass es uns leicht gefallen ist.
Ich sorge mich um dich, falls du das noch nicht bemerkt hast. Ich will nicht, dass du für Marianne draufgehst.
Und wer würde sich heute um dich kümmern?
Wenn es dir zu viel wird, lass es.
Quatsch, ist doch selbstverständlich.
Weg vom Fenster kriegen die uns nicht. Weil sie keine Macht über unsere Seele haben.
Be sure to watch Marianne and Julianne Thursday at 9 on Film International.
Those of you who enjoy good reading possibly or most probably have at least one Steinbeck novel tucked away in your reading history. A lot of my close friends prefer The Grapes of Wrath. That's their very favorite of them all. But you know what my favorite Steinbeck novel is, even above Tortilla Flat? It's a novel called Cannery Row. It's very earthy, but it has a marvelous joie de vivre about it, and I recommend you go out right after this program if you can. It'll be rather late, and get a copy. Now to Hollywood and David Ward, the man who brought Cannery Row to the screen 2 years ago.
David Ward, how did Steinbeck come to write Cannery Row?
Well, there are a lot of different stories about it. Some people said he was just ready for a change of pace, that he wanted to write something a little more whimsical, a little more humorous. Others have said that while he was a war correspondent in World War II, some soldiers asked him if he would write something in a sort of a lighter vein, something that wasn't as socially analytical as what they were used to from him, because they just basically wanted something that was fun and light and funny.
It's atypical, though, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I happen to think that a lot of it, too, was his special feeling for that area and for Ed Ricketts, who was a very influential person in his life.
He was the marine biologist who figures out his dock, doesn't he?
Hi, Doc.
Hi, Fauna. Hey, Tim. How about a couple cold ones back on the ice?
You got it, Doc.
All right.
Oh, hey, Doc, you know Susie here?
How do you do?
Well, how do you do?
Susie's just starting at the Bear Flag.
All right. I, in here to buy beer. Budweiser?
I knew this guy once who was always talking about he was going to order a beer milkshake at a drive-in. You never did? He was chicken.
Did you hear that?
Yeah. Susie? Nice to meet you.
But tell us about the writing, the adaptation. I think you went further afield, if my memory serves me, than just
a bit.
that.
Well, first of all, I combined two books. I combined Cannery Row and Sweet Thursday, which was written as a sequel to Cannery Row and is a much lesser-known book and really is not as good a book in my estimation as Cannery Row. But the problem with Cannery Row is that it's a tone poem, sort of an episodic piece. It's a series of vignettes, a series of impressions of Cannery Row. And it's not really, it's not a story that hangs together on the narrative level. So, and Sweet Thursday is much more a straight-line narrative. There's the love story between Susie and Doc. And so I combined the two. I tried to combine the love story and the narrative aspects of Sweet Thursday with the atmosphere, the feeling, the sort of the mood of Cannery Row, the texture of Cannery Row. And that's what was difficult, because just, first of all, because there are two books, there's a wealth of material. There's a lot of editing that has to be done. There's a lot of things that you have to cut out that you love, because there's so many wonderful little set pieces in both books, and there's no way to incorporate them all into a 2-hour film. So the biggest problem I had in writing the script was trying to cut it down to a reasonable movie length.
David, what kind of research did you do? I noticed a book in your excellent library here on Steinbeck's, containing at least Steinbeck's letters and so forth. Mm-hmm. You probably read that, but anything else that you did?
Well, I went to Cannery Row and talked to a lot of people who said they knew Steinbeck and knew Ed Ricketts. Unfortunately, when you do that, you get a lot of points of view, many of which cancel each other out. It was very hard to find a real Steinbeck, a real Ed Ricketts from those interviews. But I had worked several summers in Monterey when I was in college, painting houses just to work my way through college, and had always had a special love for Monterey and Cannery Row, and had read the book first when I was in high school. And so it was less a matter of research than just my sort of feeling for the area and my love of the books.
Use many lines from the book in dialogue, or as
quite
the writer?
A few.
You did?
Quite a few. You have to change. I had to change several things, and I had to add, this is germane to a question you asked me earlier, I had to add a whole subplot with this about him being an ex-baseball player and so forth, because in the novel you sort of are, there's a, by a process almost of osmosis, you sort of come to understand why an educated man would be alone, would be in a backwater town like this where there are no other people of his economic, social, educational level. That was something I felt I had to explain in the movie, because in a movie you can't sort of leave those things to, you can't let 400 pages sort of make it evident to people. You have to let them know in a more concrete way. So I invented that. But most of the dialogue, I stayed as close to the dialogue as I could, but obviously when you change story, you have to change dialogue, and it was very intimidating for me to try to write dialogue next to
John
Steinbeck.
Steinbeck.
The man I have so much admiration for. At first it was very difficult for me.
Your decision to use a narrator.
Yes.
Yes.
Again, I did that because one of the things that I find so wonderful about the books is Steinbeck's point of view on what's happening, not just the story he's telling, but his attitude toward the people. And I felt that the only way I could get that into the movie was through using the narrator, because the narrator is essentially the voice of Steinbeck.
And that was David Ward, who was not only the screenwriter, but the director of John Steinbeck's Cannery Row. In my lap is a very, very fat book indeed. It's 1,100 pages thick, and it's called The True Adventures of John Steinbeck, Writer, a biography by Jackson J. Benson, and it's published by Viking. It was a great thrill for me to go down to the outskirts of San Diego last May when we were in the Hollywood area and meet this man, because he had earlier written Hemingway, The Writer's Art of Self-Defense. He was a man well qualified to talk about the lives and the works of Steinbeck and Hemingway. We go to the first part of the interview now. Later on tonight, we'll present the second part, in which he describes the one and only night those two giants met. But now, for the first part.
Well, let me start off, Jackson Benson, by congratulating you, sir, on your book, The True Adventures of John Steinbeck, Writer. Beautiful title. I didn't realize till I dug into some background work that you were something like 13 years in the creation of it.
Yes, yes.
And you still have your hair?
Well, you know, nobody plans on spending that long of time on a project, but when I became an authorized biographer, which was toward the beginning, not at the very beginning, but toward the beginning, I realized I had a sort of obligation, you know. The family says, all right, we'll authorize what you're doing. They gave me complete freedom, but there is a sort of sense that you should do something definitive.
Right.
And then as you begin to work more and more, you realize just how much there is.
Endless.
Yeah, I mean, thousands and thousands of letters. And I was surprised, really, at how crowded Steinbeck's life was with events and things. I think the thing was, of course, that he never really talked much about his own life. And so even those of us that are academics that know something about his life from academic summaries, scholarly summaries, really didn't know what he had done in the war, for example, much about his marriages, his activities. Very few of these things had been publicized or that people really knew about.
So private.
He was a very private man, very shy man, and yet there was this contradictory thing where he seemed to know everybody in the world at the same time. It was just strange because he hated to give speeches, he hated to meet people, new people. His wife told me one time, his last wife, his widow.
And her name again?
Elaine.
Elaine.
That, and I didn't put this in the book for some reason, but she was telling me that he was so bashful about meeting people that he would sit on a plane and make her get off first at an airport in Europe or someplace in case there were reporters, or if they saw reporters, and say, you know, warm them up for me, honey. I just can't, you know, can't face that. And so she'd go out and she'd talk to them and so on. In a few minutes, then he could come out once she'd done that. But he was just terrified of meeting people.
You're in a world of psychiatry there, really.
Well, it was a neurosis, I suppose. It was just that he was a very private, shy man, you know. And yet, on a one-to-one basis with a lot of people, especially if the person was a rancher or a farm worker or a laborer or something, he could talk immediately, you know, about almost anything, you know. He was one of those people that knew so much about farming, about construction, about you name it. He knew something about it, you know.
With the paisanos, I believe.
The paisanos, yes.
Paisanos.
Yes.
He was very comfortable. But...
Oh, he loved them. And this was a great thing in his life. There was this connection with the Mexican-American. To him, they represented everything that American middle-class society was not and should be. He saw in Salinas the sort of narrowness, the political narrowness and ultra-conservatism, and he saw the hypocrisy of this lingering Victorianism that had gone on into polite American society, and it just irritated the heck out of him. And so then when as he was growing up, he made the acquaintance of a number of these kids that he knew in high school and elsewhere, and then he worked with them as a young man in the sugar plants and the sugar fields. And he just loved their way of life. They were so open, and they enjoyed life, and everything was so natural. And it just sort of made a marvelous sort of metaphor for his work and for his own thinking. That here is, you know, a natural connection with the ground, with the earth, with nature, and here are the Anglos all tight in their little houses. I don't know if you know a short story by Steinbeck called The Harness.
Nope.
It's in the Long Valley, but it sort of typifies this attitude he has about the white middle-class ranchers and so on who, this one in the story wears a harness, or I guess we'd say a girdle or a corset,
right?
Because his wife forces him to, because he tends to stoop over like farmers do.
Oh, I see.
And so the whole story is about her sort of metaphysical harnessing him to this propriety, which he breaks twice a year by going to San Francisco and living it up in Van Ness Avenue with the houses and so on, you see.
What a metaphor.
And then comes back to Salinas to be the proper upright farmer. And this was, you see, the hypocrisy. It was also the rigidity and so on. And then when she dies, he breaks loose and plants all his fields in sweet peas.
Oh my gosh.
And he wants to just go wild, and they come up and they bloom and people drive from all over. But it turns out that there's a great demand for sweet pea seed, and so he makes a huge amount of money, even though he hadn't planned on it. and so he's got all this money, and he goes right back into the old rut, and it's just as if his wife were still living with him, still alive. He's wearing the harness again. He's making changes in the house as if she were still there. It's a marvelous.
Well, that's a brilliant story.
Yeah,
I'm shaking listening to you.
Yeah.
Recount that.
Yeah, it's spooky. Yeah.
Spooky.
Yeah.
When did you write your Hemingway book?
Well, way back. It seems like a long time now.
That gorgeous title. Say it again. I love it.
Hemingway, The Writer's Art of Self-Defense. Yeah.
That is one of the most incredible biographical titles I think I've ever heard. Oh, you wrote it way back.
It was 69. Well, I was published in 69. And as a matter of fact, I started on the Steinbeck project the year before the Hemingway project came out, finally.
Of course, all these years on the Steinbeck project. Compare, you were going into some roots there of Steinbeck. Hemingway now, what were his...
so similar, you wouldn't believe it, really. Hemingway was born in Oak Park, Illinois, which is a very wealthy suburb of Chicago, called, I think, humorously enough, Saints' Rest, because of the retired ministers that congregated in the town, which I think is funny because of Hemingway's own rebellion against the propriety and so on. But he grew up again in this sort of very upper middle class environment. I wrote a little article that I hope someone's going to publish, which starts out comparing the pictures of the two families. The fathers are so similar, large, upright, tall, severe men with long black frock coats and the stiff collars and the stern looks, you know. And the women, bosomly, frilly white blouses with the bonnets, and the women with a sort of half smile on their face as if they know something that the men don't know, you know. But this sense of propriety and dignity that they have, you know, and both the parents, so much the same.
Of Hemingway and Steinbeck.
Yes, and they grew up in the same kinds of environments. Hemingway was a choir boy. Steinbeck was an altar boy. They both went to small high schools. They both became interested in reading as young people, and of course, as readers, they got involved in writing early, and both of them, I think, really gained their first success in high school, not as athletes, although both of them, high schools in those days had the same values as high schools today. Athletes were the big people, and they both tried to become football players, but they were both too big and slow. So they made their names as writers, writing for the papers and the school yearbook. And both of them were sort of class wits to some extent, you know. Hemingway and Steinbeck. Sitting back in the room and make wisecracks. That's the kind of students they were, you know.
Hemingway maybe not quite as... Was Steinbeck not a little bit withdrawn? He did sit well back, didn't he?
Yes, he was withdrawn, and he got along all right with the boys. He just was scared of the girls and was a sort of social misfit, I think, as a teenager in that sense. He wasn't part of the parties and the events that were going on, and was a sensitive kid. And it's an interesting thing. Hemingway rebelled against his parents, and as you may know, he really ended up hating his mother, who was just an extreme example of Victorian propriety. Whereas on the other hand, Steinbeck loved his parents, got along well with them, but ended up hating the town as a whole. Salinas.
Salinas, yeah.
But blaming Salinas for all of the awkward embarrassments we all have as teenagers, you know, the things that happen that embarrass you and make you feel miserable and left out. And so you have both of them rebelling, but one making it a very personal rebellion and the other rebelling against this whole environment. And I think you see this in the work.
You do.
In The Sun Also Rises, you see, in the book particularly, you see in the figure of Robert Cohen, the personalizing of Hemingway's own dislike of this character in life on whom the character was modeled, just as he personalized in the Nick Adams stories his own mother and attacks her and shows her to be very intolerant. It was really outrageous that what his mother did to him. It's understandable how he felt about her. And
what did she do?
Well, she took these books, which he had sent, his very first publication, In Our Time.
Ah.
And he was so proud of them. And she took them and took one look at the subject. It wasn't really that bad, really, you know. But wrapped them up and sent them back to him, saying that this was filth, this was terrible, that he should try to in the future, try to write something more uplifting, and why write about the bad things when there are so many good things to write about. And it was a terrible sort of rejection, and she was so self-righteous with him about things of that sort. So you can see, I mean, his reaction toward her, which of course led him to this sort of lifelong, very ambivalent feeling about females, particularly females with power, you know, in American society. And of course, a lot of American writers have had these very mixed feelings about women. Steinbeck, I think, probably of his generation, had some of the healthiest feelings toward women. Certainly, Hemingway would never have written a figure like Ma Jode in Grapes of Wrath. It was really the heroine of the novel. You know, wise, forgiving, loving, and capable, you know. This is a figure that, because of his mother, I think, largely, that Hemingway couldn't stand.
Did she live long in his life?
The mother?
Hemingway's?
Well, of course, he left early to become, as we know, an expatriate in Europe, and then later on in Key West and Cuba. And I don't recall when she died, but she lived quite a long time, and as I recall, she lived up until after World War II, maybe into the 50s or something like that. But at any rate, he really didn't have much to do with her.
No.
There were family get-togethers, and the sisters interceded between them and so on, and this sort of thing.
Jackson, what can you account for the... I'm fascinated by the creative well springs in a writer. I don't know if these things can be ultimately answered. In Hemingway, I know from your book in Steinbeck, the mother would seem to have played with that sense of magic that she exuded.
Yes.
But what about that with Steinbeck, and how might that compare to Hemingway's like creative well springs and fountainheads?
Well, I think, of course, in both cases, one wellspring of creativity was the frustration that both had, the rebellion that both had. But before that, of course, I think both of them were young kids that found satisfaction in telling stories. Believe it or not, it's really true that Steinbeck used to get neighborhood kids together and tell them stories, ghost stories and things, and this was a fairly common thing. And the kids, I mean, it was a way of gaining approval, obviously. And he also was somewhat of a prevaricator and didn't always tell the truth and told stories, you know, about things that didn't really happen. And his mother one time shook her head and said, he's either going to be a genius or amount to nothing. And it's really amazing that Hemingway was the same way. He would, as a kid, he read a lot and he loved stories, and he'd come home and tell his parents things that, you know, wild exaggerations of adventures that he'd had that he obviously hadn't had. And his grandfather said, oh boy, if he doesn't reform, he's either going to become a great artist or end up in jail, one or the other. And I thought the statements were so similar. It's weird. Really. Yeah, it's really strange. But I think in Steinbeck's case, the mother, I think, inspired him greatly with these, as you said, mentioned, the stories of enchantment, of magic forests and special places. She was Irish, and there was a lot of this Irish
little people.
Blarney, which was a great inspiration, but I think also tended in his life, too, to be kind of a contaminant. I don't mean any offense to the Irish, but he always thought of himself as half German, half Irish. And the Irish provided the mysticism in his work. The German provided perhaps the realism, the science, the naturalism in his work. And I think it really does work out that way. And his first wife was telling me that she tried to discourage the Irish, which she thought came out in sentimentality and blarney, and which was the worst part of Steinbeck's writing, and encouraged the German, or as he called it, Prussian, side of his character, you know, the self-discipline.
Is that Carol? Or am I?
That's Carol, yeah. And then I think on the other side, Hemingway's side, there was in his life perhaps no direct inspiration from his parents, as in the case of Steinbeck, but more of an admiration of people like Ring Lardner and Jack London, who led glamorous lives because they were writers. It's hard for us nowadays to think of what a glamorous figure Ring Lardner was and how glamorous Jack London was for these kids growing up. They all wanted to be like them, and I think that this is part of the inspiration for Hemingway.
It's a role model, really,
The role model, yes, and the fact that in high school both of them gained some peer approval through their high school writing. Both led them in that direction, and both of them decided to become writers rather early. Both of them, I think, about the time they were sophomores in high school. And that's a pretty early time for most people to reach a firm decision on a career.
Yeah.
And what amazed me in terms of both of them is that neither from that point on seemed to have any doubts. That's what I want to do.
Right.
And, you know, I mean, in my own case, you know, I've been insecure about my writing. So insecure I became a teacher rather than pursued writing too far, you know, as many writers do. Or you think in the back of your mind, well, if I don't make enough money, I'll sell insurance or paint houses.
But look what you've done now.
Well, that's true. But you see, if I'd had enough guts, I would have done it earlier and said, the heck with the house, the heck with everything. What they said was, I won't even consider being an insurance agent. I won't even consider doing these things. I'm going to be a writer. You know how many years it took Steinbeck to get any success at all? I think it was something like, from the time he started writing seriously in high school, I think it was more than 20 years. He was in his...
Of an apprenticeship, you mean? 20 years of...
20 years of going through school, writing, sending off manuscripts, failing, his publishers failed. It wasn't until he was maybe 35, I think, until he got any money at all, any success, any recognition.
Along with Hemingway.
Well, Hemingway was fairly late, too,
newspaper
really.
work, though, didn't he?
But he was a newspaper man, which enabled him to support himself. Yeah. But you see, that put him in a difficult position, because it's always tempting to go on with the journalism. You know? That's right. And you keep putting it off. Or you tell yourself, as many newspaper men do, I'll do it at night. I'll do it on the weekend, right? Well, if you're a newspaper man and you're a good newspaper man, it eats up your life just as if you're a good teacher, it eats up your life. You never really get free to do it. And so you have to break loose, and that's what he did. He had his wife, first wife, Hadley, had a small inheritance, and he was working, I think, for the Toronto Star.
Our own paper.
Right.
One of them, I should say.
Yes, and he had a marvelous arrangement with with two of the Canadian papers, the Toronto Star, and what was the other one?
The Globe, perhaps?
No.
Telegram?
Well, I don't recall. One was a Sunday paper and one was a daily paper, as I recall.
One was the weekly, perhaps.
Yeah, maybe the weekly.
The Star Weekly.
Star Weekly. But at any rate, he had a marvelous situation where in Europe he could write these feature pieces, and they took almost anything he wrote, you know, which is nice. So he had it really very easy. He could pick his assignments, more or less. And as a result, he traveled a lot, and he saw the peace conferences and the diplomats, and he covered the Turkish, what was it called? I think it was a Greco-Turkish war.
You got me.
Well, I think it's something like that. But anyway, that's where he got some of his material on war. And at any rate, he had to, at some point, just simply say, I've got to stop, I've got to quit. It was a risky thing because in those days, in the 20s, there was another depression, recession. And if you gave up a good job like that, it wasn't likely that you could find another one. So he took a great risk and said, okay, I've got to stop. I'm going to spend some time now, and I'm going to devote it all to writing. And so they lived very cheaply in Paris, and he did it. He worked. And he got this first publication in our time, which was just a collection of sketches, really, published in a little Paris press. And so the first big book was really The Sun Also Rises, which is in part a satire, but departs far beyond that. It's just a miracle of marvelous kind of revelation of life and his feeling for his time.
What did, something I was going to ask you at the time, I didn't want to interrupt you, got me so spellbound here.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Was Steinbeck, his first works, did he not send them?
Yes,
was there not something
yes,
similar there? I'd love you to parallel that.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because the reaction of his parents was quite different. Mrs. Steinbeck also belonged to a book club, just as Mrs. Hemingway did, and it was I think it was the book club particularly that was irate about the filth of Hemingway's book. And Mrs. Steinbeck belonged to a book club that reacted much the same way to Steinbeck's early work. I think it was Pastures of Heaven, and the book club thought that it was filth. That word must have been used a lot in Victorian, the early part of the century. And but Mrs. Steinbeck, instead of echoing that, carried the book around proudly all over town, you know? And then she became ill, and she was dying, and Steinbeck came home to take care of her while she was dying. And this is when he wrote The Red Pony, by the way. And she kept pressing his books on her nurses, telling them he was going to become a great writer someday and that they should read these books. So it's a very different relationship.
Very different.
And so in Steinbeck, of course, you see that his work is largely about the family. You know, almost every book he writes is about the family, or in the case of Cannery Row and Tortilla Flat, about a surrogate family, right? A person within a family of men or whatever.
Not Hemingway, though.
But,
I mean, no,
it's the loner, it's the soldier. And, you know, it's two very different ways of looking at the world, really. Steinbeck looks at the world as a scientist, as an ecologist, as a humanist, a lover of people, really, as shy as he was. And he sees that man as a species, and he always called man a species, should survive by becoming in touch with things. He was an ecologist back in the early 30s when people didn't know what the heck ecology was. Even scientists didn't know what it was. And this Tortilla Flat and Cannery Row, other things like that, Grapes of Wrath, really in large part from his point of view, we're talking about man's relationship to nature. Man has to realize that he's only a small part of this. And so there is this feeling of at oneness and interdependency